Welcome to the Perinatal Wellbeing Podcast. I'm Christine, your host and certified perinatal mental health professional. This podcast is all about authentic conversations. We want to open up the discussions around perinatal health and well-being, from mood and anxiety disorders to breastfeeding to grief and loss in the perinatal period, and everything in between. While this is not therapy or medical advice, it is the place where we are going to continue to open up the discussion around all things perinatal mental, physical, emotional, and sexual health to help reduce stigma and break down these barriers to support. Welcome to this episode of Perinatal Wellbeing, where I'm going to talk with Jen and Emma from Birth Trauma Ottawa. And I just want to preface by saying that we are going to talk about a pretty difficult, heavy topic, birth trauma. Maybe stories or specific examples might come up. So I want to preface that so that you can press pause or listen to a different episode if that feels like it would be too much for you. Make sure to take care of yourself if you're listening to this episode. Pause if you need to, reach out for support if you feel like anything that we talk about today is really impacting you. And so I want to welcome Jen Gillean and Emma Fernando from Birth Trauma Ottawa. So hi, both of you. How are you?
Good. Thanks, Christine. How are you doing?
Good. I'm actually so excited. And I know for some people listening, maybe that sounds weird, but being a therapist and in the perinatal world, I'm really excited to talk about birth trauma, to continue to open up this conversation. We've had some personal stories on the podcast, and we've definitely touched on trauma, of course, in a few episodes. But I think it's important to keep talking about this because there's still so much misunderstanding. I think stigma, I think discomfort around the topic. When a friend or family member experiences birth trauma, a lot of people don't know what to say, don't know what to do. And so I would love to talk about that. And of course, too, talk about what you both do with Birth Trauma Ottawa, how that came about and, what support looks like for people. How does that sound?
Excellent.
Yeah. Okay. So if you'd like to share with me kind of what brought you both together, and what do you do at Birth Trauma Ottawa?
So Jen and I met in 2017. We've both had our own experiences with birth trauma, and we actually met at a birth trauma retreat. And the two of us connected. We found we just had a lot of similar interests in terms of kind of what we were looking for and community supports, and we sort of stayed in touch for a little while. We had run some birth trauma groups through another organization called Birth Trauma Ontario. I call it the speakeasy way of doing things, but it was sort of like under the radar. We didn't have a ton of ability to sort of gather kind of group members, and when kind of COVID came around and just a little before the groups were dwindling, in that time, I had another birth trauma in 2021. And when I left the hospital, I realized that kind of the resources were sort of exactly the same as after my first traumatic experience with birth. And once I was feeling like I was in a bit of a better place, I approached Jen and I said, hey, I think we need to do something. Because I think that we're still really lacking in the community support department, and I think Ottawa needs something. And Jen was on board as co-pilot, so that's how we started it.
Amazing. And so, Jen, do you want to share with us what is available at Birth Trauma Ottawa? What support looks like with your organization?
So we still recognize that there are a lot of people who prefer online support or virtual support. And there's a real longing, I think, for people to connect in person as well. And so we were pretty committed to having in-person meetings. And it was this past, I think, September we got started. But we also offer like hybrid meetings as well. And we started as just sort of in person under the umbrella of birth trauma. Um, and I think a few months ago, I don't remember when exactly, I was a little bit better with the details than I am, but we started an online group for healthcare professionals around birth trauma as well. And we are looking to the fall in terms of adding perhaps something around abortion support. I do some other work with another organization around pregnancy and infant loss. So perhaps also adding a few groups with regards to that, the specific needs or the specific experiences of folks who go through either abortion or pregnancy and infant loss.
Absolutely. That's incredible. We're also looking forward to the fall groups and looking at providing abortion support and mainly probably for families in the queer community, and also grief and loss groups for folks in the queer community as well. I just don't think there's enough support, which is, why I think we're all doing this work, right? And it's so interesting too that your experiences brought you two together. That's what I find common too. My experience of postpartum anxiety, depression brought me into this field. I think all of my colleagues that I can think of, which is a lot, but most of us, it is like it's our experience that brings us into the field, or realizing, like you said, Emma, the lack of support, the lack of resources, the lack of education, like not even knowing that these experiences are possible and not even knowing what they are or like how to name them. And then we're experiencing them and we don't know what's happening, what's going on, right?
Yeah.
I think another thing to consider too is if somebody is having, trouble, for example, or they're struggling with something, culturally we've gotten in the habit of just say, oh, go see a counselor, or go for a massage, or take your own time and space. And yes, there is, the individual supports that are really important to people, but I think one of the things that are really important to us is the community part and showing up for each other as parents, and as humans rather than
Individually.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you both feel? I mean, this might sound like an obvious question, but I think we're going to see the impacts for years to come, but the impact of the pandemic on how babies have been brought into the world, how parents have coped or not coped with bringing babies into the world, because we are not meant to do that in isolation. And then if you add a traumatic experience onto that and how difficult that is to recover and try to figure it all out in isolation.
Well, when Jen and I originally, like last year, when we were sort of chatting more about it, I think one of the biggest instigators was also COVID. It was just knowing the impacts that COVID's had just on the public in general, and then realizing what it would look like for individuals who were, trying to create families, for people who were in those birthing spaces for that postpartum period, what it looked like to be isolated without services, what it looked like to be without partners, or being able to see loved ones, or being able to celebrate those little wins with the people in your immediate support team, and not having access to those things. It was another big piece of why we thought it was so important and why we were so keen on bringing people back in person if they were willing to, because I feel like so many people have lost so much already, and then to miss out on all of those things in our, we call it our village, but our community that should just be there to us to support us, is like, it's asking it's asking people to do the impossible. We do the meetings every month, of course. Sometimes we get a lot of people and sometimes we don't, but it's unbelievable how even every week we get messages that are from people who have delivered from, it's been years, you know, whether it's been years in the pandemic or pre-pandemic, but in the pandemic, and just those experiences and how those journeys are sort of still like holding on, right? Because they haven't really had the opportunity, and they weren't given the opportunity to sort of have what we all would have had pre-pandemic.
Yeah. Right. And that like healing and community and that community support, you know, like you're both mentioning, right, is so helpful. And I always have talked about the magic of groups. I love running groups, but I find it so impactful in the perinatal population. Just that like, oh, me too, or like, yeah, I struggle with this, you know, in whatever like scenario, whether it's parenting or, you know, bringing kids into the world, you know, the physical challenges, the mental health challenges, the emotional challenges, whatever that looks like. But I'm finding like groups in this population are just so helpful, right? Like you said, Jen, it's kind of like, oh, just go to a counselor, or like just work it out. But that group work can be so helpful and impactful. And I think the peer support work, you know, is just so key and so important.
I think when you were speaking about birthing through these times, one of the things that really landed for me over the past few years with the pandemic, and particularly when we're talking about trauma, if we're looking at like, you know, the criteria that one would consider to define their traumatic experience, so to speak, or their consequences of feeling the trauma, is the risk factor of a previous traumatic experience and or being raised by somebody who themselves have either a diagnosis of PTSD or experiencing, you know, the consequences of post-traumatic stress. And so, you know, sometimes we talk about community involvement, or we talk about, you know, generational trauma that's specific to only particular communities or kinds of people, for example. But really, you know, the consequences of generational trauma through this time is, I think, really worrisome. And, you know, not only when we talk about risk factors, but we also talk about, you know, post-traumatic growth, or the ways with which people make their way through traumatic experiences. And with the isolation, that wasn't really possible for so many people. And even if we just bring it down to, you know, I'm geeky about the nervous system, the idea of our children cannot learn to self-regulate without co-regulation. And we need that also as humans with each other as well. And so, you know, that's why one of the reasons why I think in-person support or peer support is really supportive and nourishing for a lot of people, because we can help each other to self-regulate through co-regulation. And so when we're able to give voice to our stories, we're also getting out of that mental loop that some of us get in, either with like certain triggers, for example, or certain like thoughts, or maybe it's the way that somebody said something to us at our birth, or actually what happened, for example. And we can go on these like mental thought patterns, you know. And so when we have the opportunity to give voice to our experience with other people who probably didn't go through the exact same thing, but some of the sensations are similar to them, some of the thoughts that they've had are similar to them. And so it's really a beautiful thing to hold space for another person, even if their experience is different than yours, or how you would have responded is different. And I think that, yes, we talk about the risk factors over the past few years, and, you know, the conditions that people were birthing in. But like you said, like the postpartum isolation, I think, has added a whole other layer for people to not be able to move through patterns that might feel like they're stuck or are not supportive for them.
Absolutely. Because we know that connection can be a way to regulate our nervous systems, like you said, and to, you know, close those stress response cycles in the body, and also to recover from trauma. right? Connection is a big part of that. And absolutely, especially too, like I see in groups, or even when I'm connecting one-on-one with clients, and they've heard my story, or they know a bit about my story of, and now I'm better. Like, yes, it was the hardest time of my life, and now I'm better. Like, I was able to access recovery. So there's hope, right? When we see that hope in other people, and like you said, Jen, like seeing other people with a regulated nervous system and they're able to manage their triggers and the things that activate them, it's like, oh, it's
Mm-hmm.
possible. I can do this. I can get better. People do get better from this. I think that is like, it's so, so helpful. So let's talk about, we want to talk about like, what is birth trauma? We've talked about it a bit. I do love talking about the nervous system. And so, if you both want to share from your perspectives, like, how would you define birth trauma? Or, I mean, that's a very
That's a
tough
hard one.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what do y'all think? What is it that if someone's listening and they don't know anything about birth trauma, what do you want them to know?
I think I keep it simple, you know.
Mhm.
If you felt like you or your baby might have died, or they did die, then that's a traumatic experience. And there are some either physiological or mental consequences from the experience.
Yeah. 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 We'll talk about those for sure. Emma, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I feel similarly to Jen in that like I feel like if there was any threat, like I feel like that threat of danger, that threat of something going wrong, the threats of being out of control, not being privy to the conversations that were had, not being a part of the decisions that were made when decisions are made for you.
Mhm.
Um, I really, approach it with the idea that if somebody feels like they experienced a traumatic birth or, part of their perinatal period, then we make space for that, you know, and
Yeah.
how you feel is how it happened.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what your papers say. It doesn't matter, maybe what your care providers might have told you.
Mhm.
If you feel like you experienced trauma or
Mhm.
a traumatic birth, then you did. Um,
Right.
and learning how to kind of make space for that story and that journey. And yeah, that's sort of where I sit with it.
And I think it's important
Yeah.
to say like the threat is like real or perceived, you know. And
Exactly.
what
Yeah.
Emma's saying is like up to that person to define it.
Yeah.
Exactly. I support families who've had an experience of baby being in the NICU, and my co-facilitator, who's a nurse, who was a NICU, bedside NICU nurse, um, often is able to explain like some of the medical things where, yes, sometimes like it was perceived by the parents that the baby was going to die, but in actuality, baby wasn't going to die, but they're still walking away with those symptoms of post-trauma because that is how they experienced it, even though they didn't know like, the medical terms and jargon and what was really going on in the moment. It is that perception,
Yeah.
right? And often that like feeling of helplessness, right? Like I can't do anything to help me or my baby. And you made a great point, Emma, too, of like not being involved in the conversation or the decisions being made around your own care or baby's care. That can contribute to trauma. Not being spoken to, in the moment, or healthcare providers kind of just talking as if you're not in the room,
Yeah.
feeling abandoned, feeling not supported, feeling alone. And we're going to continue to see those after effects, I think, from people who were actually really alone delivering, during the pandemic.
Yeah. And I think I mean, there's this is a there's a lot that goes on kind of, in kind of the healthcare sort of world in terms of like our perinatal population and sort of what our healthcare providers do for us and like in a lot of circumstances we have a lot of trust in the people who are caring for us and our little ones and the people that we're carrying, right? So I think a lot of it also comes down to the fact that people sometimes overlook how important it is to include the people who are actually birthing in sort of the conversations, and, you know, speaking to a little bit of what you were talking about with your colleague, in terms of like, yeah, that might not have been something where the baby was actually in danger, but the parents felt that way. It's also like communicating to the parents that are involved about like what is happening, you know, where sometimes they're just not even a part of those conversations and they're being talked over. And it's disappointing, because where we could have maybe facilitated something or a conversation to go a different way, like a piece of that puzzle is overlooked and we've missed an opportunity to help somebody, you know, somebody where it could really be like that pivoting point of whether they feel like they were in distress or their baby was in distress, or whether they don't. Yeah.
So I think too, that's a big topic, and definitely one that I want to have an episode dedicated to that. Unfortunately, we do, you know, we're all in Ontario. Our OHIP covered healthcare system, for the most part, is not trauma informed. And when we talk about like the settings, the hospital settings where a lot of us have given birth, those practitioners are not trauma informed, which can lead to trauma, to us experiencing trauma that doesn't have to happen. I agree. There's a lot of points in people's stories, and you both tell me if you see this too, and not just in your own story, but in other people's stories that come to your support group, but of where there's like instances of like, if something was done differently in that moment, this person's story could have potentially turned out differently.
For sure. I mean, I think the other thing that's really important to add to this conversation is so many of our healthcare workers are, you know, we say that they're not trauma informed, but they know trauma. You know, they also know how to bypass their own trauma because they have to show up at work the next day. And so, you know, if somebody isn't able to, you know, embody their own experience because they actually have to shelve it at home to show up to work the next day, you know, we're creating the perfect conditions for people to be, you know, experience more and more birth trauma, for example.
Absolutely. Like when you talk about intergenerational trauma, right? When our parents or ancestors haven't, you know, done the work for whatever reason, it's not a judgment. It's just like the opportunity wasn't there. We don't talk about it, whatever that looks like, right? Then that creates the risk for traumatizing our kids, or right? Like when we don't have the
even
opportunity.
If we just look at it as skills and capacities, you know,
learn, exactly.
How to have difficult conversations with our healthcare providers, you know, knowing that we might, you know, put them in the expert seat, you know, how to listen to ourselves when we're like, that doesn't really feel right. Or wait a second, what do they mean by that? So, of course, you know, again, the conditions are ripe for, you know, for ongoing generational trauma. And I do feel that, you know, with all of the awareness now, that there are more possibilities for conversations and for learning, and, you know, knowing when to say something or when to pause, or knowing when to say, hey, can you say that again? Because I have no idea what you just said. There's also a lot of possibilities and hope that I do have with regards to what can be learned. And it's also incredibly disheartening to realize just how, you know, I know everybody says broken our healthcare system is, but how much we rely on a healthcare system that's not necessarily working.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so just kind of like reiterating those potential risk factors to trauma, do you both want to share some of those risk factors that you know and that you see that in your work?
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of us, we see, you know, if previous, any kind of previous trauma. So sexual trauma, childhood trauma, intergenerational
Medical trauma as well.
If you're, yeah.
Yes.
We talk about occupational trauma, the things that we see, like even when we're talking about our healthcare providers, like we're looking at a team of people who are here to care for others who are also experiencing, like Jen was saying, trauma every single shift they're working. And if they're working in areas of high risk or high trauma units with the perinatal population, then yeah, they're looking for ways to come back to work the next day, And then then you have a whole other group of people who work in those areas who are seeing these types of situations, who are also trying to have families, and what that looks like for them as well when they're birthing, So we're seeing a lot of that as well in our groups, where it's people who, do work with the perinatal population who are giving birth and what those experiences end up being like for them, which is also very challenging. And then to go back after to work.
Yeah. And that vicarious trauma, right? If they're seeing birth trauma after birth trauma after birth trauma and holding that and carrying that, and then potentially going into their own birth situations, and how that vicarious trauma can impact that fear, like being present, right? In the body and in the nervous system. And I know, Jen, you like to talk about the nervous system, in terms of conceptualizing trauma. So can you do that for us? Can you share that with us?
So when I am using the language of the nervous system, I often start with the window of tolerance, sort of that space where we feel like, I don't like to use the word safe because I think that's a complicated word for people who have experienced unsafe situations before, or myself, I grew up like, lifeguarding and first aid. So for me, safety is like a physical safety thing. When I talk about the window of tolerance, I talk about that like space that we have where we can be connected in our day, where we can feel engaged in the present moment. And if we've, slept, well, our window of tolerance might be a bit wider. If we have been like eating really well, or if we have really good support systems, our window of tolerance might be a lot bigger. But the opposite is true as well. So if we haven't slept very well, if we don't have a lot of supports, we're not feeling very well nourished by what we're eating, our window of tolerance can shrink. And so why is the window of tolerance important? Well, yes, that's the place where we can be present, where we can be connected, maybe not experience like supreme happiness or joy, but where we can be content and function. And it's normal, to throughout the day to bounce around a little bit within that window. But when we kind of get into a place of upregulation or activation, sometimes I use it like, some people might experience like physiological symptoms of anxiety, for example. It's more like that extra energy. We can get bumped out of our window of tolerance. And so I think of the roof of the window of tolerance, maybe it starts with a little irritation. Maybe we might get angry. We have all of these physiological cues that our body, tries to kind of give us a little nudge like, hey, you know what? We're not really coping very well in this moment. And the opposite can be true as well. At the bottom of our window of tolerance, that's that space of like down regulation or low arousal. And sometimes I talk about it more like a heaviness, or maybe there's more of a fogginess with the thoughts, or, there's that less like muscle tension that you might see in upregulation. And so when I'm talking about the nervous system, oftentimes when it comes to trauma, I mentioned upregulation or downregulation, but there's dysregulation. And so oftentimes folks who are working their way through the physiological consequences of a traumatic experience, there's that bouncing around that happens. So maybe we get triggered or something, creates a strong reaction in us, and we might get like that fight or flight where we're like, hey, what's going on here? Or maybe we're like, I got to get the hell out of here. Forget it. I can't have this conversation. That's like that fight or flight that a lot of us hear about it. And so when we have a strong reaction, and it's great. I love anger. I think, we're humans. We're supposed to feel all of these different sensations and emotions. It's just when we are experiencing them for a long time, there's consequences to long-term stress. And so it oftentimes ends up, exhausting us when we might have an outburst, for example, or a trigger that we're working our way through. And so we might be bounced up high to outside of our window of tolerance. And then when we don't have those energy resources to sustain us, then that's when we can collapse. So oftentimes with dysregulation or with trauma, there's that bouncing around of the nervous system. And so it's really hard when a trigger happens and we're not necessarily paying attention to the like, oh, you know what? Last time I went to a prenatal shower, I had a trigger. What was going on there? So bringing that level of self-awareness to our embodiment and different situations, we can really learn to care for ourselves in a way that is nourishing, whether that's setting boundaries or saying, you know what, I don't really need to hang around those people, or I don't really need to go to that party, or you know what, I can just go to sleep and really take care of myself tonight. So that's usually how I talk about the nervous system. Obviously, like our actual nerves are related. So there is a very physical aspect to this. And so that's why I like bringing it back to the body, because one of my teachers has said, like, the body is always present in the now. Our brains can take us to a different place, even when we're, working through a trigger. Our body, we can dismiss our body and override our body. But oftentimes, there are little breadcrumbs along the way that if we actually was like, oh yeah, you know what, sense of agency is really important to me. And I know if I get into this situation, I'm not going to be able to know what to say. So I think there's a real honoring in working through your nervous system and coming to the language of the nervous system, or polyvagal theory is sort of what it's sort of understood as. And I love that, because so many of us think that we're broken because of what happens to us. We think that there's something wrong with us, or I'm not a good enough mom, or I'm not a good enough partner, or I'm not a good enough friend. It's really hard to wrestle with, because we often care about the people around us, and we do want to show up for the people in our life. And sometimes we almost have to learn to do that through showing up for ourselves. Almost all the cliches are true, putting the oxygen mask on. But it's really hard to learn that growing up in a culture where we're like, be successful, be productive, there's so many expectations placed on people.
Yeah. And I love using the nervous system to normalize our physiological responses to traumatic events. And it doesn't even have to be trauma. It can be just like any activating event. So when we say like activating, we mean, right, like that nervous system response of like, okay, here's some adrenaline and cortisol, and let's, increase your heart rate and your blood pressure. And so you can be ready to fight or flight, for example. In the moment when we are at that point where it is our body and our nervous system that's choosing the response. That's involuntary. That's not a conscious decision. Like, oh, I'm going to freeze now, or, oh, I'm going to run away now. It's my body is like deciding and figuring out the threat and what is the best way forward. Right. And so I like to normalize that too, because when you talk about those different responses, right, we can have that, on that. I'm using my hands and no one will be able to see this when they're listening to the podcast, but at the top of that window of tolerance, that's that fight or flight response, like you were talking about, in that hyper aroused state, or that high freeze response, like the deer in the headlights, so to speak. And then that, in that hypo aroused state, that lower like dysregulation, where we might fawn or, freeze, right? So that fawn response of like, kind of just going along with it. As a practitioner, I see this a lot in people who are giving birth. I saw this in myself, even though I'm a loud person. I like to think I can advocate for myself really well, fight for my kids, et cetera, et cetera. But with doctors, I'm like, yeah, of course. Yeah, sure. Like whatever you think. Meanwhile, I'm like, no, that's not what I want to do. So a lot of people have guilt or shame, like for having that fawn response when they are in delivery, labor and delivery, and kind of need to do some processing around that. And I try to normalize that of like your nervous system felt that that was the best way to survive in that situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Emma, did you want to kind of give your thoughts around all that before I know you have to go, but what are your thoughts?
I think I mean, Jen covers it really well, which is why when Jen's speaking about the nervous system, I just let it go because it's like the perfect description. And it's like the perfect teachable moment. But no, I feel similarly, like the window of tolerance is kind of, you know, for myself and when I'm talking to other people, kind of like that guide. And we talk about that roller coaster. And I think one of the other reasons Jen and I started Birth Trauma Ottawa as a group and decided we were going to show up every month was because it doesn't matter how long it's been. Sometimes you'll have those activating moments or trigger moments, and something will spiral in you, you know. And with trauma, that's not uncommon, right? Like we do have these moments where, like, our body has attachment to these these memories and you know, these situations, and so we keep the group open so that it doesn't matter, you know, if it's right after you've had your delivery or months later, that if you're looking for somebody to come and talk to, then this space will always be there, you know. Because I mean, in my journey especially, I know this, I can say this for myself, and I'm sure Jen and other people would speak similarly, that it's, you know, it's not a healed and you're done. It's a long progressive journey of kind of tapping into those moments where you think you're kind of coming through a little less of the woods, and then you're like, oh, I just fell down back into the creek, you know. And then you kind of have to figure out a little bit more of something that you might need to try or do, which is why I think, like you said, it's not all or nothing. It's not just counseling, it's not just medication. Sometimes it's not just, but you know, the group is such an important aspect of that validation piece, knowing what other people are going through.
Yeah. And I think that speaks to an important point of like, time does not heal all wounds. I like to say, like, that's not a thing. It is the act of processing that trauma experience and that story, right? Like, even Jen, you were mentioning, right? Like that storytelling piece. Like, as humans, we have the ability to tell stories, and that's a very important part of being a human. And so we use that to process, you know, things that happen to us, whether it's trauma or bad things or good things or whatever. And, you know, you hear people sometimes like say it, tell the story over and over and over and over and over. And they're like processing a piece of it every single time. Right. And so I think that's really important, and to have those spaces where we can continue to do that, because we hold it in our body, like you said, in our nervous system. And if we don't do that intentional processing, it's not going anywhere. It will stay there. And I've had clients who've been like 7 years out, 5 years out, still having those trauma responses because they didn't have a chance to process before, right? So, Jen, do you want to share kind of what are those after effects that can come from experiencing birth trauma? What can this look like afterwards that maybe you've experienced or that you see in the people that you support? What do you want people to know about those experiences of, like, if you're experiencing this, maybe take a look, like this could be stemming from birth trauma. What do you want people to know about that?
Well, I think, you know, for a lot of people, you know, that upregulation piece is more normalized, you know, because, you know, oftentimes you'll have that extra reserve of energy. So for a lot of people, that might be muscle tension, you know, or that feeling like you got to keep going, you got to keep moving. You know, you wake up in the morning, you're like, go, 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 go. And so, you know, it's a hard conversation to have, because I think that with that dysregulation, there's the upregulation or high activation and, you know, low activation. And so it can look quite different for different people, depending perhaps how far away they are from their experience, or perhaps what they've normalized. But for example, I think a lot of people end up having difficulty sleeping, whether that's mostly because of busy thoughts, for example, or that muscle tension. Like they might have a tight jaw, for example, or you know, some people really feel upregulation in their chest. They might feel like that that heart rate going. Other people. Some people feel like anxiety or more of a trauma response in their belly, for example. Other people, it can be, feeling like you're not in control of your emotions. Like if you have that smaller window of tolerance, you might I don't know if I can swear, but like you might lose your shit super easily.
Yeah.
But it's also, the idea of disassociation, you know, and a lot of us have come to some of these terms in a really, we almost think of disassociation in a really fixed way. Whereas, it can be just checking out of the present moment, not being able to pay attention to what the person in front of you is saying. You might be like hanging out with your baby and totally thinking of something else. What else? Then there can be the too nervous to leave the house, being super rigid around particular schedules, for example. And again, there's I think what's really challenging about this is there's a normal adjustment to being a new parent. And so, trauma can leave you feeling like that internal barometer is off. If you felt like you're on top of your game, you knew yourself and you knew what you needed to, that can feel like it's a completely different capacity after you've given birth and had a traumatic experience. So I'm not really speaking about all of the physiological consequences, but when you you spoke a little bit about cortisol and adrenaline. And so if it's a sustained amount of upregulation or stress, or, whether it's, again, what's stressful to one person is different than what's stressful to another person. But if you're feeling like what you've got going on in your day is too much, we can't sustain hormonally that high level of arousal or activation. And so then we feel that sense of depletion, so, we might feel like in the morning, we might have a lot of energy. We might be like sharp. We might be like, go, 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 go. And for some of us, we might end up feeling like, okay, I need to have that second coffee or third coffee in the afternoon to kind of make it through the day. And that can kind of prolong some of our crashes, or energy crashes, so to speak. But then, some of us might, go to bed at like 7 o'clock if our kids are going to bed then. Or some of us might need to just collapse in front of the TV at night. And even though we wanted to maybe do some other things, the energy reserves aren't there. There's that sense of depletion. And maybe the next day, maybe we end up having a good sleep. Maybe we end up, eating really well, or, taking care of some of our nutritional considerations in terms of restoring after stress or a busy day. But oftentimes it's like we're just, adding a stressful day on another stressful day. And then, throw in life like a family crisis or anything that happens, renovations for some people, having to move, and certain things just feel like it's too much. So oftentimes people might have difficulty sleeping. Oftentimes, people, like, I'm also work as an herbalist. So even if we're talking from a digestive perspective, oftentimes, people have issues with their digestion, either irregularity or, too much, like dampness in their bowels, so to speak. We might,
and I think
we might feel the need to like self-isolate, because we're too much or too intense, or don't feel like we have the energy to fake it on that day.
And I think that feeling, you touched on that of like, I can't get my shit together. I just feel like I'm not coping like I would normally, quote unquote, right? Like maybe pre-birth or pre-baby, or, maybe this, like you said, like maybe this is a second or third child. And like, after the first kid or the second kid, I coped okay. But I'm just like really not getting it together. I cannot cope. I think it's important to differentiate between like, usual like parenting is really hard, and like the adjustment to a new baby, or, figuring that out, right? It's like, it feels like extra, like it just feels heavier. It feels harder. And this, even the fatigue part of the tiredness, right? It's like, I remember explaining it like, this is not newborn baby tired. This is different. It feels different. Or like your baby is sleeping, somewhat, but you're not able to sleep, or you're waking up even if baby's not waking up. That again, like it's like I like to say it's a cue, right? Take a look, right? What's going on for me? How am I feeling? Is this related to like I have a little baby, or is this something more? And even a lot of times, like even if people can't verbalize, or they don't know like the language for the symptoms, a lot of people just say like, I don't feel like myself. I feel off. Like I don't feel like me. Like you said, like I can't get my shit together. That's important to listen to.
And I think also our loved ones could be mirrors for us as well, and if we're, finding ourselves, obviously our relationships change over a lifetime. And the birth of a baby is no different. But there can sometimes be like extra conflict, or extra irritation, or, your needs actually change, and so that can be a sign to look to as well. Like sometimes I'm like, why am I being such a bitch right now? And then I realize, it's because I'm being triggered right now in this moment. Even the realization once of like, I switched dentists, and I'm like, why am I so angry every time I go to the dentist? And it wasn't until I made the connection that sometimes I describe the experience of having a cesarean almost like going to the dentist, where you feel like people are working on you physically, and, you're there, you're present, but they're just focused on your physical body, and so I found for myself, bringing that awareness piece to why am I so angry in this moment, or why is this bothering me so much, was a really good thread to follow in terms of, it's because I don't feel like I can really express myself right now, or it's reminding me of when I was, having to make the decision on to have the epidural or not have the epidural, or, like if most of our responses don't come out of nowhere.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Right. It's our nervous system is telling us like, be alert. There's danger here. Right. Because it's perceiving danger. Right. And I just wanted to touch on too, just in terms of the language around nervous system, is actually a colleague who works with a lot of newcomers to Canada, was talking about, how sometimes the language of nervous system doesn't land for some people who maybe English isn't their first language. And sometimes talking about just stress, like our stress responses, maybe sometimes for some people is easier to understand, or like it's my body's reaction to stress, like how I'm dealing with stress or living with stress, right? And yeah, so for some of us who are not familiar with the language of nervous system too, it's like that activation is just like our our response to danger. Our body's trying to decide what to do. I just wanted to kind of throw that in there.
No, I think that's really important.
Yeah. And so what are some, from your perspective and from, of course, Birth Trauma Ottawa, but what are the help, the support, and treatment? What can these things look like for people who have experienced traumatic birth?
I think, we talked a little bit about capacities, and it's not so much, I think we shove self-care down people's throats as if it's like, who would want to go for a massage every day? But learning that self-awareness, and learning to like work with our body in terms of necessarily seeing it as something to, overcome, from that top down perspective. So really honoring the sensations as they come up, I think is really, a capacity that a lot of us aren't taught. Think about it at school. Like, you have to go to the bathroom, you put your hand up. Maybe you're going to be allowed to go, maybe you won't.
Yeah.
So the, and some of us have a long history of a difficult relationship with our bodies. And so, I don't say that lightly in terms of learning that self-compassion, and learning how to work with our body as the cues are coming up, or as the stress responses are coming up.
How do we help people or direct people in real life to learn these things? Where do they go?
I think that's a really, really important question. And, it does depend, without assuming that people have a whole year off in Canada,
right.
Or, there's the assumption where it can be really challenging for, if you're in a partnership, to have that support that you might need to be able to seek other supports, so whether, and we have complicated relationships with our parents as well, so, and we talk about this village, but, I think the village died long time ago.
Yeah, where is it?
But there's still the expectation or the assumption that it's still there somewhere. So, whether it be a friend or a neighbor or a coworker, if you don't have close family relationships or people that you can depend on, really trying to seek that out, or build on it in a particular way. And even if it's just like one person that you can trust to come over when you feel like you're having a really off day, because it's hard to ask. It's hard to ask somebody else to show up for us when we feel like we can't even show up for ourselves some days.
Absolutely.
So there needs to be some space to be able to do it, and without just like from a privileged perspective of like, take your own time and,
get a manicure.
Yeah. But I think honestly, the basics, and it sounds like the basics are foundation, but like a lot of people don't even think to drink water.
I agree.
A lot of people, there's also like pressure to have this body that bounces back after, so we're not necessarily nourishing ourselves really well from a food perspective. And sometimes that might look like like nourishing yourselves might look like, not being so perfect every day about it either, so caring for ourselves requires space. And it does require some relationships, I think, where we can feel like we don't have to do it all ourselves all the time. And that self-compassion for like, we're going to screw up.
A lot.
Yeah. But the willingness to be curious about a trigger, or why am I avoiding this particular situation? Or why is this person really bugging me all of a sudden? So really having the willingness to be curious and follow those threads.
Yeah, I love that.
And see where things are connected as well. Because like we said, like nothing, most stress responses don't come out of, thin air. There's usually like, there's usually a pattern.
And that's why I like to name those things, like that can be a cue or a symptom, like whatever the person connects to, like whatever language, right? Like that's a cue for me to look internally of like, what's going on for me and what do I need? Like maybe, like you said, maybe it's rest, maybe it's connection, maybe it's movement, maybe it's water, maybe it's food, like, and whatever that looks like for you, right? It also does not mean like everything organic and perfect, like you said, right? It just means like getting some kind of food into your body that day in a way that works for you, right? And I think that like also that community piece, like where is the village? You're right. So building your own village, right, of supports that you connect to, and whether that's in your area, whether they're cultural supports, religious supports, spiritual supports, therapeutic supports, whether it's a therapy group or a therapist or a peer support group, right? So again, that community piece of like other parents, right? Or other parents who experience birth trauma, that can be a community, right? It is a community, right?
The other thing that you're speaking to that reminds me of, that I probably kick myself for not mentioning, is making space for the grief in your life as it comes up.
Yes. And I was thinking of that before. I was like, oh, I got to mention that. Yes. Thank you so much, Jen. And there can be a lot of work like post-birth trauma of it's important to be able to separate the grief from the trauma. They're two different things, and we are going to deal with those in two different ways, right? And I think it's important to remember like the grief around the experience we had. Oh, that did not go how I wanted it to go. That did not go how I thought it would go. That actually isn't the beautiful story that I wanted or that I even want to tell people about. You know, I've had people say that, right? Like, I don't even want to share my birth story because it's so medical and it's not what I wanted it to look like. There's a lot of grief in that. And we know grief doesn't go away because whenever you think about your birth story, it will not change. There will always be grief associated with it. And that's okay, right? We have to be able to have that space. Like you're talking about, we need the space to feel the grief. Okay? It's layered and complicated and messy, right? Yeah, absolutely. And I know we touched on this before when we were talking before recording, but also that piece of, for a lot of people, it's uncomfortable. Like, I think, especially like North American culture, we're not very comfortable with like death and dying and grief and loss, and especially associating that with welcoming a baby into the world. People get so uncomfortable. So then we hear well, at least, you know, your baby came home with you, or like, oh yeah, but you're alive. Like, it's okay. Like, you didn't die when you had your traumatic experience. You know, I've had clients who've had people say that to them, you know, well, you survived. Okay, but it was also terrible. Right. And then having that also, like, the day my baby came into the world was also the worst day of my life, for example. That can be really hard to sit with. Right.
I think for a lot of people, that can surface, you know, around the baby's first birthday.
Oh yes, absolutely.
You know, and they forget, you know, that we're actually human, and one of the things that makes us human is that we can actually hold more than one emotion, or more than one feeling or perspective. You know, that we can be grateful and still grieve what happened or what didn't happen, or some of the relationships that may have been lost, or that sense of self that might not be what it was. So there can be a lot of different kinds of grief that weaves itself into becoming a parent, or grounding into that role of being a parent.
Absolutely.
And so I think when it comes to, you know, birth especially, you know, everybody just wants, you know, sunshine and rainbows, you know, and a lot of people aren't comfortable with real vulnerability and real grief, you know, or anger. You know, I think anger is in there too, where, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. And so in terms of Birth Trauma Ottawa, what is that community? What is that support that you all provide there?
So we have monthly gatherings, in person, and also the possibility of connecting online. So for folks that might want to share their experience. And like you said, like sometimes when we, you know, there's so many different moments in a birth, and maybe there's certain ones that we might be focused on more so than others. So some of us, to share our story more than once, you know, we might share the medicalized version, or this happened, then the sequential, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then that happened. And then, you know, maybe if we show up the following month, because we've already shared that medical version, maybe we need to share a piece that, the conflict that we're maybe having with our partner, or that feeling of they don't, my friends don't really get it.
Yes.
Um, and so there are different parts to our stories and our lives that birth trauma can affect and influence.
Mhm.
And time doesn't necessarily heal all wounds, but time can bring up different aspects
Yeah.
of our experiences.
Mhm.
And so being there every month allows people to, maybe things are going really good after the first time you come. And, especially this time of year, we're all busy. And then maybe you're leading up to, your baby's second birthday or your baby's first birthday. And you're getting a lot of, strong feelings or sensations coming up. That might be a great time to come back and talk to people. What I love about the group is that it's there for when it's needed. But when people do come back and, it's not necessarily their first time, it's really beautiful to see how people can acknowledge each other's experiences, even if they're different than their own. And you also touched a little bit before, and I don't love this word hope necessarily. Because sometimes it can kind of take us out of the now and just focus on a later thing. But I think that that's needed sometimes, if we're feeling stuck or broken or there's something wrong with us, to have that willingness that it's not always going to be like this can be really inspiring for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that, it can change, things can get better. I can heal, right? Again, not magically, but by showing up for myself, taking care of myself, doing the hard, vulnerable work of processing, right? Not easy. And not everyone wants to or needs to, whatever, like different for everyone. Not everyone processes their trauma stories in that way, right?
And maybe we don't have the capacity or the support to do it in that first year or even second year following the birth or a difficult experience.
Exactly. This is not a like, you have to do this by this time and this time, and this is exactly how it should look. Like I said, it's messy, it's layered, it's complicated, it's different for everyone. But my hope is that, of course, this is a big topic and we could, probably talk about each single aspect for like 3 hours each, but I think my hope is that, like, at least opening the discussion, like getting some of this language out there and like having people hear this. And like I said at the beginning, if any of this resonates, like, please reach out, to any of us. All the contact info will be in the show notes, but where can people contact you and Birth Trauma Ottawa?
So myself and Emma can be found like on Instagram and Facebook, Birth Trauma Ottawa. We decided we keep it as simple as possible.
Amazing.
And myself, I'm like in the moment with Jen. And so I do share like definitely tips and tricks of things that have worked for myself. And yeah, I think, finding trusted people that you can connect with is really important. And whether that be a stranger, or a neighbor or a coworker, I think it is important to reach out when you're feeling like you're ready and you can have the space, because, like you said, it ain't all sunshine and rainbows. It can be pretty messy.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jen. And thank you to Emma as well for coming on, sharing with us about birth trauma and, what that can look like, and about Birth Trauma Ottawa and the work you do there, which, if anyone's in the Ottawa area, check them out. And I so appreciate the work you do and the way you support people in the community. And just thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please share this podcast with any of your friends or family members who may benefit from it. If you feel you are experiencing any of the symptoms or issues that we discussed today, please reach out to any one of your supports or go to perinatalwellbeing.ca for more information, blog posts, podcast episodes, and ways to connect with us. Check out our new episode every other Monday.